Wherever you are right now, whether you're in bed with the lights already off or settled somewhere quiet with the world outside still and dark, take a moment before we begin. Drop your shoulders, slow your breath, because what you're about to hear is not legend. It is not mythology dressed up as history. It is something older and, in many ways, stranger than both. It is a legal record. In the winter of 1889, a team of archaeologists working under the direction of the University of Pennsylvania pushed deeper into the ruins of the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur, in what is now south-central Iraq. They were excavating a mound locals called Nippur, a place the Sumerians had called Nippur, one of the oldest inhabited sites in the world, a city that existed before most of human civilization's chapters had even opened. Beneath the surface of that mound, sealed beneath centuries of compacted earth, they uncovered a temple library, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, pressed together and preserved by the very collapse that had buried them. The tablets were removed, cleaned, catalogued, and distributed between the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia and the Museum of the Ancient Orient in Istanbul. Scholars began the slow, painstaking work of reading what was pressed into the clay. Most of the tablets were what you might expect from a temple library: hymns, administrative records, lists of gods, ritual instructions. But one tablet, eventually given the catalogue designation CBS 9205, stopped its first translators in a way that the others did not. It measured roughly 6.5 inches by 4.5 inches. It was dense, with wedge-shaped cuneiform impressions pressed into a surface the colour of pale sand. And when the scholar George Aaron Barton finally published his translation in 1918 under the title Miscellaneous Babylonian Inscriptions, the scholarly world found itself reading something that had no easy category. It was the story of a crime, and the criminal was Enlil, the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon. The text was not ambiguous about what happened. The 50 great gods, it stated plainly, and the 7 gods who decide destinies had Enlil arrested. The word used was not symbolic. It was the same word that appears in administrative texts describing the detention of human criminals. Enlil, lord of all lands, holder of cosmic authority, the deity whose utterances could not be altered, was walking through the Kiur, the central district of divine Nippur, and was taken into custody by his fellow gods. The verdict was immediate. The sentence was exile. The text reads, in the translation preserved by the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford University, Enlil, the ritually impure, left the city. Ninurta, the ritually impure, left the city. Enlil, in accordance with what had been decided, Ninurta, in accordance with what had been decided, Enlil went. In accordance with what had been decided. Not by Enlil, not by Anu, the Skyfather above him, by the assembly, by process, by a verdict reached through a council whose authority was sufficient to compel even the most powerful god in the cosmos to walk out of the city with his head bowed. Barton noted the legal phrasing, but treated the text primarily as a creation myth, focusing on what the story produced, the births of several gods, rather than on what it revealed about the mechanism of divine governance. And for the better part of a century, most scholars followed that path. They read the arrest as incidental colour, as a moral backdrop, as a framing device for cosmological poetry. But some researchers, including the great Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer and the historian of religion Thorkild Jacobson, kept returning to something that the framing device interpretation couldn't easily explain. The arrest passage was not unique to CBS 9205. Variations of the same legal language, the same assembly, the same 50 great gods and 7 deciders, the same phrase invoking prior decision and binding verdict, appeared across multiple independent texts, discovered at different sites, composed across a span of centuries. The same institutional structure appeared whether the text was about the creation of the moon, the theft of cosmic authority, the trial of a goddess in the underworld, or the punishment of a hero who exceeded his mandate. This was not the language of one poem borrowing a colourful phrase from another. This was a consistent legal framework, repeated, documented, and evidently taken seriously by those who inscribed it. What you're listening to tonight is an investigation of that framework, tablet by tablet, verdict by verdict. The Sumerian texts do not merely mention divine law in passing. They record it with the specificity of a court archive. They name the charges. They describe the deliberations. They record the sentences. And in doing so, they raise a question that even the most cautious academic cannot dismiss with ease. If the Anunnaki had laws they were bound to follow, and those laws were older than the gods who enforced them, where did those laws come from? We won't answer that tonight. No one can answer it tonight. But we can read what the clay remembers. Before we go deeper, if you're listening from somewhere particularly quiet tonight, somewhere with a story of its own, feel free to share it in the comments. The place where you first hear something is sometimes part of the experience. And now, let's go back, much further back. Before the first law was written, what the Sumerians meant by order. There is a temptation, when approaching Sumerian civilization from the modern world, to begin with what we know, with writing, with cities, with agriculture, and to map our understanding of those things onto what we find. It is a temptation we have to resist here, because the Sumerians understood the relationship between order and existence in a way that has no clean equivalent in any modern framework. For the Sumerians, the cosmos did not simply exist. It was arranged. Everything that was real, the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Euphrates, the authority of a king, the baking of bread, the proper conduct of a funeral, all of it existed because it had been assigned a function and a boundary within a larger system. The Sumerian word for this organizing principle was me, typically written with a single sign in cuneiform. Scholars have struggled for over a century to find an adequate translation. Divine laws is the closest English approximation, though it is inadequate. Sacred ordinances comes closer. The fundamental properties that make things what they are is perhaps the most accurate, though far too unwieldy to use in ordinary discourse. What the me represented, at the most fundamental level, was the idea that every element of civilization, every office, every craft, every social relationship, every ritual, every category of power had a proper form. And that proper form was not invented by human beings or casually assigned by gods on a whim. It pre-existed both. It had always been. It simply had to be held, maintained, and transmitted. Thorkel Jacobson, whose work at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago made him one of the 20th century's most consequential Mesopotamian scholars, described this framework in his 1976 study, Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion. He observed that in the Sumerian conception, the world was not governed by pure power, not by a god who could simply do whatever he wished, because he was stronger than everything else. It was governed by the interaction between power and order. A god might be immensely powerful, but his power operated within a domain defined by the me, and he was answerable for how he managed that domain. The entity primarily responsible for holding the me was Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and magic, whose city was Eridu, the oldest city in the Sumerian tradition, positioned at the southern edge of the civilized world, close to the waters of the Anzu, the primordial underground sea. Enki's house was called the Iabzu, the house of the abyss, and within that house, according to multiple Sumerian texts, Enki kept the me stored, maintained, and distributed to those who had been assigned responsibility for them. The full list of the me, as best as it can be reconstructed from the fragmentary Nippur tablets and from the text known as Inanna and Enki, number ECSL 1.3.1, is astonishing in its scope. Among the items enumerated as belonging to the me are kingship, the descent of lordship, the holy offices of the priesthood, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the reed worker, wisdom, attentiveness, holy, purification rites, the kindling of fire, the extinguishing of fire, strife, triumph, counselling, comforting, judging, and decision-making. Also listed deceit, the rebel lands, heroism, power, wickedness, and righteousness, alongside the plundering of cities and the making of lamentations. Read that list slowly. These are not the attributes of a particular god. They are not the mythology of a culture. They are the inventory of a civilization, every force that structures human life, catalogued and attributed to a system of divine management. The Me did not distinguish between what we might call good and bad. They were not moral categories. Deceit and righteousness were both among them, equally real, equally in need of proper management. The implication was not that deceit was sanctioned, but that it existed, and that its existence within the cosmos required administration. It needed to be held by someone responsible for its proper use. This matters enormously for understanding what the divine laws were and what it meant to break them. When a god in the Sumerian text violated the divine code, the violation was not simply a moral failure in our sense of the term. It was a structural disruption. It was the improper management of a Me, or worse, the removal of a Me from its proper holder, its use outside its designated domain, its application in a context for which it was never assigned. This is what made divine violations so catastrophic in the Sumerian imagination. It was not that a god had done something wrong in the way that a human being does something wrong. It was that the fabric of existence itself had been pulled in a direction it could not properly sustain. The second major concept that governed the divine legal framework was Nam, often translated as fate or destiny, but more accurately understood as the determined nature of a thing. Nam was what made a king kingly, what made a priest priestly, what made the sun, and the underworld, the underworld. Nam was assigned by the assembly of gods, and once assigned, it was, in the formulation that appears across dozens of Sumerian texts, not to be altered. The great formula, which appears word for word in texts spanning centuries, runs something like, its utterances cannot be changed. The word which it has spoken will not be turned back. This is not poetry, it is a legal standard. It is the equivalent of a decree made permanent by the authority of the issuing body. The third element was the Dubnamtara, the Tablet of Destinies. This was conceived in the Sumerian and Akkadian sources as a physical object, a clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform writing and impressed with cylinder seals that served as the master document of cosmic authority. Whoever held the Tablet of Destinies held the legitimacy of the entire divine order. Enlil's authority as the supreme administrative deity derived not simply from his power, but from his custodianship of this tablet. The tablet did not grant power, it conferred legitimacy upon power. And the theft of that tablet, as we will see in the Anzu narrative, was not merely a robbery, it was a constitutional crisis of the highest order. Alongside these three elements, the Me, the Nam and the Dubnamtara, the divine order was maintained through a specific institution, the Ukin, the Divine Assembly. Thorkel Jacobson, in his landmark 1943 paper Primitive Democracy in Ancient Mesopotamia, published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, argued that the Sumerian model of cosmic governance mirrored the political structure of early Sumerian city-states, in which major decisions were made not by a single autocrat, but by a council of elders and freemen. The gods, in the Sumerian conception, did not operate under an absolute divine monarch whose word was simply law. They operated within an assembly in which even the most powerful entities were subject to deliberation, debate, and binding collective decision. This is a remarkable thing to find embedded in the world's oldest body of literature. The idea of accountable governance, the idea that even the highest authority is answerable to a formal process, is usually presented as a relatively recent achievement of political philosophy. And yet here it is, articulated with precision and consistency in texts pressed into clay in the third millennium before the Common Era by a civilization that had been writing for longer than any other on the planet. Enlil's role within this system was not that of an absolute monarch. He was its most powerful administrative figure, but his authority was derived from the tablet he held, derived from the nam that had been assigned to him, derived from the consent and legitimacy of the assembly. When the assembly moved against him, as it did in the Enlil and Ninlil text, his power did not protect him. The assembly's authority superseded his own, in accordance with what had been decided. The Anunnaki, within this framework, were not simply gods in the popular sense, divine beings worshipped by humans and exempt from the rules that govern lesser creatures. They were, in the most precise Sumerian usage, members of the assembly. The term itself, Anunnar or Anunnaki, is most literally translated as princely seed or offspring of Anu, though even this translation remains contested. What is not contested is their textual function. They were the institutional body of divine governance. They sat in the assembly, they deliberated, they voted, they issued decrees, and they enforced those decrees not only upon human beings, but upon one another. The oldest Sumerian writings about the Anunnaki do not describe them as creators of humanity in the dramatic alien engineer sense popularized by 20th century writers. They describe them as a council of decision makers. Their primary function, as the ORAC database at the University of Pennsylvania records based on the texts of the Old Babylonian period, was to decide fates, to issue binding determinations about the character and course of things. The scholar Alhena Gadotti and others have noted that the Anunnaki appear in the lament texts specifically as the body whose decisions initiated the destruction of cities, the withdrawal of divine protection, and the punishment of communities that had failed to maintain the proper order. This is the world into which we are descending tonight, not a world of arbitrary divine whim, not a world of cosmic chaos policed by brute force, a world in which order was understood to be the fundamental nature of existence, in which that order had been formalized into a body of law, and in which even the most powerful figures in the cosmos were subject to that law's demands. The question is, what happened when they weren't? The court of heaven, how the Anunnaki govern themselves. The word Ukin appears in Sumerian cuneiform texts in contexts that leave very little interpretive ambiguity. It means assembly. More specifically, it means a formal gathering, convened for the purpose of deliberation and decision. The Ukin of the gods is mentioned in administrative texts from Nippur, in mythological narratives from in lament poems, in royal hymns, and in cosmological epics. Its consistent appearance across all these genres, across a span of recorded history stretching from the early dynastic period through the Old Babylonian era, roughly 2800 BC to 1600 BC, suggests that it was not a poetic device. It was a documented institution. Jacobson's analysis in Primitive Democracy in ancient Mesopotamia drew on exactly this consistency. He observed that the divine assembly in Sumerian texts has specific repeated procedural features. It is convened at moments of crisis. It deliberates. It hears from multiple parties. Its members express opinions, sometimes in disagreement with one another. It issues binding decisions, and those decisions, once made, carry the force of the Nam, the unalterable decree. What Jacobson identified was that this was not the mythology of a culture that imagined power as monolithic. It was the mythology of a culture with deep institutional experience of collective governance, projecting that experience upward onto the cosmos. The assembly met in the Ubu Kina, a term usually translated as the Chamber of Fates or the Assembly Hall of the Gods. This space is described in texts as a specific architectural location, a courtyard within the divine complex at Nippur, furnished with seats for the gods and reserved for the highest civic deliberations. The meeting place was neither symbolic nor casual. Texts describe specific seating arrangements, specific protocols for who could enter and who could speak. The standard formula that opens a divine assembly in crisis is preserved across dozens of texts and was evidently a fixed form of institutional language. The gods convene. The situation is described. Individual gods are called upon to act. Sometimes they refuse. When they refuse, the record notes this. It is not suppressed, not regarded as impermissible, but recorded as part of the deliberative process. This is the structure of a functioning legal institution, not the structure of mythology used to explain natural phenomena. One of the most striking features of the assembly's documented procedures is the role of the seven gods who decide destinies, the seven Nugigana, or judges, who appear repeatedly as a distinct committee within the larger body. These seven are not a poetic grouping. They appear as a specific institutional role, a subset of the assembly with particular authority over the most consequential decisions, the assignment of fates, the punishment of violators, the determination of who lives and who dies, and under what terms. They appear in the Enlil and Ninlil text as joint authors of Enlil's arrest warrant. They appear in the Descent of Inanna as the judges who condemn the goddess in the underworld. They appear in lamentation texts as the body that authorized the destruction of cities. The same seven, the same institutional function, the same legal weight across texts composed by different scribal schools in different cities across a span of centuries. This kind of consistency does not happen accidentally in mythological literature. It happens when people are describing something they understand to be real or to have been real and feel an obligation to describe it accurately. The procedures of the assembly, as they can be reconstructed from the textual evidence, included several features that would be recognizable to any student of law. First, there was a principle of notice. Before a decision was issued, the relevant parties were aware that a deliberation was taking place. Second, there was a principle of deliberation. The records consistently show gods speaking, proposing, arguing, and sometimes disagreeing before a decision is reached. Third, there was a principle of binding verdict. Once the assembly decided, the decision had the force of the unalterable Nam. And fourth, there was a principle of enforcement. The assembly did not merely issue paper decrees. It had the capacity and the documented willingness to compel compliance, including from its most powerful members. The enforcement mechanism is particularly significant. In human legal systems, the enforcement problem is a perennial challenge. Who polices the police? How do you compel the powerful to comply with decisions they could simply overpower? In the Sumerian divine assembly, the answer appears to have been structural rather than purely coercive. The legitimacy of a god's power, his or her Nam, was inseparable from the assembly's recognition of it. A god who violated the divine code did not simply face punishment from without. He or she faced the withdrawal of the institutional legitimacy upon which his or her authority rested. Enlil's power came from the assembly. When the assembly turned against him, his power was not diminished in a physical sense. He remained the storm god, the controller of winds and floods. But he could no longer exercise that power legitimately within the city of the gods. He was ritually impure. He was outside the order. He had to leave. This principle, that divine authority is derived from and answerable to a larger order, appears not just in the Enlil and Ninlil text, but across the entire corpus. No god in the Sumerian tradition exercises absolute sovereign power. Anu, the sky father who sits at the top of the divine hierarchy, is the highest ranking member of the assembly, but he is still a member of it. Enlil, as its primary executive, remains subject to its decisions. Enki, as the keeper of the me, acts as a kind of constitutional guardian. He cannot be simply overruled, but neither can he simply do as he wishes. When Inanna takes the me from him, he attempts 6 times to recover them, dispatching creatures and servants to intercept her boat on the river. He fails 6 times, and then, significantly, he accepts the outcome. The text ends not with Enki recovering the me by force, but with a formal reconciliation, Enki acknowledging Inanna's claim and establishing a new arrangement within the framework of the order. Even the god of wisdom, whose cleverness is his defining attribute, operates within a system that constrains him. This constraint is the heart of what the Sumerian divine code actually was. It was not a list of prohibitions posted on a wall, it was a system of assigned responsibilities, mutual acknowledgements, and binding precedents that governed how divine power was to be held and exercised. And violations of that system were not treated as unfortunate accidents or metaphorical moral failures. They were treated as specific actionable offences requiring specific institutional responses. The assembly of the Anunnaki, in other words, was a court, and the texts that survive from Nippur, Uruk, Eridu, and the other cities of ancient Sumer are, among many other things, its case records. When the storm god was exiled, the trial of Enlil. The crime is stated without equivocation on tablet CBS 9205. Enlil was ritually impure. He had coerced Ninlil, a young woman of Nippur, by the banks of the Id Numbetum canal against the explicit warnings of her mother, warnings that, the text makes clear, constituted a recognised social and religious prohibition. Ninlil's mother, the goddess Nunbashi Gunu, had told her daughter not to bathe in the holy river. His eye is bright, the Lord's eye is bright, he will look at you. The great mountain, Father Enlil, his eye is bright, he will look at you. The shepherd who decides all destinies, his eye is bright, he will look at you. Straight away, he will want to have intercourse. The warning itself is a remarkable passage. It does not describe Enlil's looking as something to be celebrated, it describes it as something to be avoided. The mother knows what Enlil's attention means. She knows the power differential. She instructs her daughter to stay away from the river precisely because the most powerful god in the cosmos cannot be expected to restrain himself. And yet, the text that follows makes clear he was expected to. His failure to do so was not excused by his power. It was the basis of the charges against him. The 50 great gods and the 7 gods who decide destinies did not deliberate at length, at least not in any surviving portion of the text. The conclusion is presented as already reached. The arrest has taken place. The verdict is in. Enlil is impure. He must leave the city. And the phrase that carries the full weight of the legal system is the one that concludes the passage, in accordance with what had been decided. This phrase is not rhetorical flourish. It is a specific legal formulation that appears in the same functional context, marking the point at which a deliberative process has concluded and its output must be executed in multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts. Scholars including Jacobson and later the legal historian Reuven Yaron have noted that Sumerian administrative and legal documents use this type of formulaic closure to indicate that a decision has been reached by proper procedure and is therefore binding without appeal. The same structure appears in contracts, property transfers, and royal decrees. When it appears in the Enlil and Ninlil text, it is not being borrowed from legal language for poetic effect. It is being used in its primary sense. Enlil does not protest. He does not invoke his authority as the Lord of all lands, holder of the tablet of destinies, the god whose utterances cannot be changed. He goes. The most powerful figure in the cosmos walks out of the divine city in compliance with a verdict issued by a body he normally presides over. This is, on its own, one of the more extraordinary moments in the entire corpus of ancient literature. There is no appeal. There is no resistance.
There is only compliance, because the assembly's authority in this system was structurally prior to any individual's power, no matter how great. The other tablets used to construct the composite text of Enlil and Ninlil add additional dimensions to this picture. CBS 8176, 8355, 3009, 1322, NA412, and 13853 from the Penn Museum collection, along with BM 38600 from the British Museum, and tablet 2707 from the Museum of the Ancient Orient in Istanbul, represent 18 separate manuscripts of this myth, all from Nippur, all dating to the Old Babylonian.
Period roughly 1900 to 1600 BCC, and all substantially consistent with one another in their rendering of the arrest scene. The multiplicity of copies suggests this was a text considered important enough to reproduce and preserve across multiple scribal generations. Scribes were not simply copying it as a relic, they were maintaining it as a document with ongoing significance. The question that arises, and that mainstream scholarship has not fully settled, is what the precise nature of Enlil's impurity was. The Sumerian term used in the text is a term associated with ritual pollution, a state that rendered an individual improper for participation in sacred spaces and activities. Jeremy Black, in his critical edition of the Literature of Ancient Sumer, published by Oxford University Press in 2006, argues that the impurity is specifically ritualistic, that Enlil's offence was not simply coercion in a human moral sense, but a violation of the sacred purity required of those who administered the divine institutions of Nippur. The city was a sacred space. Its inhabitants, even when those inhabitants were gods, were subject to its purity requirements. Enlil had contaminated himself, and by extension, the space itself. This reading has significant implications. It suggests that the assembly's action was not a moral judgment in the modern sense, not a condemnation of Enlil as a bad person, but an institutional response to a structural violation. Enlil had compromised his fitness to hold the offices he held. The assembly was not punishing him for wickedness so much as it was enforcing the conditions of legitimacy. An impure holder of sacred authority could not exercise that authority without tainting the authority itself. He had to be removed until the impurity was resolved. The alternative reading, proposed by Dale Laundeville in his 2010 study Celibacy in the Ancient World, suggests that the mythological framework was encoding a social norm, the prohibition of premarital sexual coercion, by showing its violation, even by the supreme deity, to have institutional consequences. In this reading, the myth is not primarily a legal record, but a wisdom text, using divine drama to establish and reinforce behavioural standards for the community. Both readings may be simultaneously true. The Sumerian texts consistently operate on multiple registers at once. They function as records, as instructions, and as philosophical explorations of the same material. What both readings share, crucially, is the acknowledgement that Enlil's action constituted a violation of a recognised rule, that the assembly responded with a formal process, and that the outcome of that process was binding on even the highest divine authority. What happens after Enlil leaves the city is itself worth examining closely. He does not disappear. He takes on three disguises: the gatekeeper, the man of the underworld river, and the ferryman. And in each disguise he lies to Ninlil about his whereabouts. He conceives 3 more children. The text cycles through a triple repetition of the same scene with formal precision. This tripling is not merely narrative variation. In Sumerian legal and literary convention, a threefold repetition often indicates a systematic or complete action. It is a way of signalling that a process has been exhausted, that all available iterations of a situation have been explored. Enlil's 3 disguises may represent the 3 domains of the cosmos: the city, the underworld river, the ferryman's crossing, through which his exile takes him, and the 3 additional offspring he conceives are understood by Gerald Cooper to represent the underworld deities who maintain a parallel divine order beneath the surface world. The text ends with a hymn of praise to Enlil. He has completed his sentence. He has been restored. The punishment was finite. The exile was the fulfillment of the verdict. And once the sentence was served, the divine order continued. This too is a feature of a functioning legal system rather than a mythology of divine revenge. The purpose of the punishment was not annihilation, it was correction, the restoration of proper order after a disruption. The exile was not a permanent removal, but a period of accountability, after which the convicted party could return to his function. The assembly, in other words, was not simply punitive, it was restorative. Its goal was the maintenance of the divine order, not the destruction of those who had disrupted it. And that distinction between punishment as vengeance and punishment as order restoration is one that runs through the entire body of Sumerian divine law like a thread. The code that was not metaphor, reading the me as divine legislation. When Samuel Noah Kramer first published his translation of the me list from the Inanna and Enki myth in Sumerian mythology in 1944, he treated the items in that list primarily as representing the gifts of civilization, the things that Inanna took from Enki and brought to Uruk, which is why Uruk became great. This reading was not wrong, but it was incomplete. It focused on the destination of the me and what they meant for human civilization, and it somewhat underweighted the implications of what the me represented in the context of divine governance. The text of Inanna and Enki, catalogued as ECSL 1.3.1, is preserved in fragmentary form across multiple Nippur tablets, with the best preserved segments providing a list of the me that runs to well over 100 individual items. The myth's narrative structure is this. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, travels from her home in Uruk to the city of Eridu, where Enki keeps the me in his Abzu. Enki, knowing she is coming before she arrives, the text makes a point of his foreknowledge, welcomes her with beer and food at the Lion's Gate. They drink together. Enki becomes intoxicated. In his intoxication, he begins to give the me to Inanna one by one, naming each item as he transfers it. In the name of my power, in the name of my Abzu, I will give them to holy Inanna, my daughter. Inanna receives them, loads them onto the boat of heaven, and departs for Uruk. When the beer clears from Enki's head, and he realizes what he has done, he attempts to recover the me by dispatching increasingly formidable agents to intercept Inanna's boat at 7 successive points along the river. Each time, Inanna's minister Ninshuba defends the boat. Each time, Inanna challenges the intervention. How could my father have changed what he said to me? How could he have altered his promise as far as I am concerned? How could he have discredited his important words to me? Was it falsehood that my father said to me? Did he speak falsely to me? Has he sworn falsely by the name of his power and by the name of his Abzu? This challenge is not simply rhetorical, it is a legal argument. Inanna is invoking the binding nature of an oath made in the name of Enki's power and of his Abzu. An oath sworn in the name of divine power and sacred space was, in Sumerian legal convention, the highest form of binding commitment. It could not be revoked. Enki had transferred the me under oath. The oath bound him. When Inanna reaches Uruk and the me are distributed to the citizens in a grand ceremony, Enki sends a final message, not of continued pursuit, but of acceptance. The text ends with a reconciliation, Enki acknowledging the legitimacy of Inanna's possession and the establishment of a new divine order in which Uruk holds what Eridu once held alone. What the myth reveals, when read as a legal text rather than simply as a narrative about divine rivalry, is that the me were transferable objects with specific conditions of ownership. They could be given, they could be received, they could be disputed, they could be held under oath. And the question of who held them was a constitutional question, because the holder of the me was the entity responsible for their proper administration. The transfer of the me from Eridu to Uruk was, in this reading, not just a mythological explanation for why Uruk became powerful. It was a record, from the Sumerian perspective, of a constitutional redistribution of divine authority. The catalogue of items in the me list repays careful attention. Among the items listed in the fully preserved segments of ECCSL 13.1 are the office of the on-priest, the office of the lugal priest, divinity itself, the great and good crown, the royal throne, the noble sceptre, shepherdship, kingship, the offices of 6 different categories of priest, constancy, going down to the underworld and coming up from it, sword and club, the black garment and the colourful garment, forthright speech, deceitful speech, grandiloquent speech, the cultic prostitute, the holy tavern, the holy shrine, the art of song, venerable old age, heroism, power, wickedness, righteousness, the plundering of cities, making lamentations, rejoicing, deceit, kindness, the crafts of the carpenter, coppersmith, scribe, smith, leatherworker, fuller, builder and reed worker, wisdom, attentiveness, holy purification rites, the kindling of fire, the extinguishing of fire, strife, triumph, counselling, comforting, judging and decision making. Notice what this list contains. It contains opposing forces, wickedness and righteousness, forthright speech and deceitful speech, the plundering of cities and the making of lamentations for the plundered. This is not a list of things the gods approved of. It is a list of all the forces that constitute the reality of civilized existence, the forces that need to be held, administered and properly channeled if the order of the world is to be maintained. The god who holds the me for deceit is not authorized to be deceitful. He or she is responsible for making sure that deceit, as a force that exists in the world, operates within its designated boundaries and does not overflow into domains it is not supposed to touch. The scholar Peter Esbach, in his doctoral dissertation on Enki in Sumerian royal ideology, published at the University of Tartu in 2010, makes the observation that the political demise of Eridu, as the primary centre of divine authority in the 4th millennium, reflected in the myth as Inanas. Successful appropriation of the me was experienced by the Sumerians not as Eridu losing a competition, but as Eridu's sacred responsibilities being taken on by a new custodian. The me did not disappear from Eridu and cease to function. They were transferred. Their administration continued, just under different management. This framing is significant for our purposes because it illuminates what a violation of the divine code involving the me actually looked like. A violation was not simply misuse of a power, it was the failure of proper custodianship, the holding of a me without the proper authority to hold it, or the exercise of a me outside the domain for which it had been assigned. When Enki tried to recover the me from Inanna after the transfer, he was not simply expressing possessiveness. In his sober re-evaluation, he may have been attempting to fulfill a custodial obligation, to recover powers that had been transferred under conditions of impaired judgment, and that therefore might not constitute a legitimate transfer. Inanna's counter-argument that the oath was sworn in the name of his power and his Abzu was her assertion that intoxication did not void the legal force of the transfer, because the oath invoked not his momentary will, but his permanent institutional authority. The assembly, in this instance, was not called. There was no formal trial. The dispute was resolved between the parties. But the resolution was achieved through the application of the same principles that governed assembly proceedings, the binding force of oaths, the constitutional significance of authorized transfer, and the precedent established by the formal acceptance of the new arrangement. The legal framework was present even where the institutional form of the assembly was not. This is an important observation because it suggests that the Sumerian divine code was not simply a set of rules that required external enforcement. It was, in some sense, internalized by its participants as the framework within which all transactions, including divine ones, had their meaning. Enki did not pursue the matter through force, because he understood that the binding oath had already settled it. The me belonged to their proper holder. The system had worked, even if its working had been unexpected. The theft that unmade heaven, Anzu and the Tablet of Destinies. If the Enlil and Ninlil text shows us the divine code functioning as intended, a violation committed, the assembly acting, a verdict rendered, a sentence served, the Anzu myth shows us what happened when the violation was of an entirely different order of magnitude, not the contamination of a sacred space by a powerful god, not the transfer of divine authority through an intoxicated oath, the theft of the fundamental document of cosmic legitimacy itself. The Anzu myth survives in both a Sumerian version preserved at Nippur and a standard Babylonian version whose most complete tablet comes from Nineveh, British Museum Catalogue number K3454+, with additional tablets from Saltantee providing supplementary material. Wilfred G. Lambert's scholarship on the myth, along with Dalia Shihata's more recent academic analysis, published through the Wedge podcast academic series in 2020, has helped establish the mythological and legal dimensions of the narrative with considerable precision. The setup of the An story is this. Enlil holds the Tablet of Destinies, the Dubnam Tara. The tablet confers his authority over the cosmos. It is not simply a powerful object. As Andrew R. George documented in his 1986 paper Sennacherib, and the Tablet of Destinies published in the journal Iraq, the tablet was understood as a legal instrument, a permanent legal document that conferred upon the god Enlil his supreme authority as ruler of the universe. Custodianship of the tablet meant the right to determine fate, to issue unalterable decrees, to exercise the authority of the divine order. Ans, a divine storm bird, a being of enormous power who was originally given a position of honour near Enlil's sanctuary, watched Enlil perform his morning ablutions, removing his divine regalia, and seized that moment of vulnerability. He took the Tablet of Destinies and flew with it to the mountains. The consequences were immediate and total. The Babylonian version states that when Ans took the tablet, the cries of the gods fell silent. Directives were suspended. The functions of the divine offices were interrupted. Enlil's mouth could not issue decrees. The system through which cosmic order was maintained had been deprived of its constitutional document, and without that document, nothing that needed authorization could receive it. The cosmos was not physically destroyed, but its governance had been paralyzed. This detail is precise in a way that mythological colour commentary would not typically be. The myth does not say that Ans caused chaos by breathing fire or flooding the earth. It says that without the Tablet of Destinies, Enlil's decrees could not be enforced, because the legitimacy that the tablet conferred had been removed from its proper holder. The problem was constitutional, and the solution would have to be constitutional. Someone had to recover the tablet. Not because Ans needed to be physically defeated, the gods, including Anu himself, had power enough, but because the document had to be returned to its proper custodian, and that return had to be accomplished through a specific institutional process. The assembly convenes. Anu asks for a volunteer to pursue Ans. In the Babylonian version, 3 gods are asked in sequence. The precise identity of the first 2 varies across manuscript traditions, but the structure is the same. They are asked to go, they assess the difficulty of the task, and they decline. This refusal is not cowardice presented as narrative flaw. It is a genuine assessment of the problem. Ans was not simply a physical opponent. He possessed the Tablet of Destinies, which meant that any divine power directed against him could be countered by the tablet's authority. As the text explains, when Ninurta finally engages Ans and fires arrows at him, Ans commands the arrows to return, and they do, because the tablet gave him the power to command the me of weaponry. The divine code itself had been turned into a weapon. Eventually Ninurta, son of Enlil and warrior god, accepts the mandate. His mother Belet Eli prepares him and sends him to the mountains. The battle is fierce. The famous passage in the Babylonian version describes Ninurta's arrows flying toward Ans and turning back, again and again, until Ninurta receives a new strategy, a tactic that exploits not power but the conditional nature of the tablet's authority. The details of this strategy vary across versions, but the outcome is consistent. Ninurta defeats Ans, recovers the Tablet of Destinies, and returns it to Enlil. The return of the tablet is the restoration of the constitutional order. Ninurta has not simply won a battle. He has restored the legal foundation of the cosmos, and the reward the assembly offers him reflects this. They declare that his name will be spoken in the seat of honour, that his house will receive tributes, that his greatness will be proclaimed. They are doing precisely what they did when any holder of divine authority was confirmed in that authority, pronouncing his name, assigning him formal institutional recognition. As for Anz, the mythological tradition is somewhat variable on the precise fate of the bird god, but the Babylonian version is clear that his defeat was final. The crime he had committed was not simply theft, it was the seizure of the constitutional document of the cosmos, with the intent of displacing the existing order of divine authority and substituting his own. This was the highest category of divine offence, not a violation within the system, but an attack on the system itself. The punishment was accordingly absolute. What the Anz myth reveals about the divine legal code is its structural character. The code was not simply a list of prohibitions backed by divine power. It was a system in which legitimacy, the right to exercise authority, was itself a defined, bounded, documented thing. You could not simply have the power, you had to hold the authority properly. And when someone seized authority improperly, the system had a specific response: the recovery of the document that conferred it through a formally authorized process, and its restoration to the proper custodian. The assembly in the Anz narrative does not simply declare Anz an enemy and send forces against him. It deliberates, it asks for volunteers, it mandates. Ninurta does not pursue Anz on his own initiative, he acts under the authority of the assembly's commission. The return of the tablet is a legally authorized act. Even the enforcement of the divine code, when it was most urgently needed, proceeded through institutional form. The arrogance of the victor, Ninurta's own punishment. There is a postscript to the Anz story that receives far less attention than the main narrative, but which may be, from the perspective of the divine legal code, the most revealing passage in the entire episode. Ninurta had just done what no other god had been willing to do. He had faced the most dangerous criminal in the history of the cosmos. He had recovered the constitutional document of the divine order. He had restored the governance framework of the universe, and the assembly had praised him lavishly. The text that describes what happened next is the Sumerian composition known as Ninurta and the Turtle, TCSL 1.6.3, preserved in fragmentary form at Nippur. Samuel Noah Kramer published a critical analysis of an associated text in the volume of Aula Orientalis published in his honour in 1987, the essay known to scholars as Ninurta's Pride and Punishment, which discusses how Ninurta's victory over the Anz bird led, in a related mythological tradition, to a crisis of divine arrogance. The Nippur text is explicit about what happened. After his victory, Ninurta was not satisfied. The text says, the hero secretly was not happy with these promises. Where he stood, he darkened and yellowed like a floodstorm. He contemplated great deeds, and inwardly he was rebellious. He uttered a word which has no. The hero Ninurta set his sights on the whole world. This is a description of a god who, having received legitimate recognition and reward, wanted more. Not simply more honour, but the expansion of his authority beyond what had been assigned. He had, in the interiority of his divine intention, decided to exceed his mandate. He had not yet acted. But Enki, whose capacity for foreknowledge is a consistent feature of his character across the Sumerian texts, understood what Ninurta was planning. The great Lord Enki intuitively grasped the substance of the plan. What followed was not a trial. It was a trap, or more precisely, a preventive measure delivered through the Anzu, through Enki's constitutional domain as keeper of the divine code. Against Ninurta, Enki fashioned a turtle from the clay of the Anzu. He stationed it at the gate of the Anzu, in ambush. He lured Ninurta close to the place where the turtle was hidden, and the turtle grabbed Ninurta's tendon. The hero fell. He and the turtle tumbled together into a pit that the turtle continued to dig, deeper and deeper, while Ninurta struggled and could not free himself. Enki then appeared above the pit and spoke down to him from, "You who set your mind to kill me, I cut down, I raise up. You who set your sights on me like this, what has your position seized for you? How? Where has your strength fled? Where is your heroism? In the great mountains you caused destruction, but how will you get out now? This speech is the key to understanding the legal significance of the punishment. Enki is not simply mocking a trapped enemy, he is delivering a verdict. He is articulating the principle that Ninurta had violated, the principle that having power and being authorized to exercise it are two different things. Ninurta had the physical capacity to set his sights on the whole world. He had just demonstrated that by defeating Anzu. But the Nam that had been assigned to him, the boundaries of his authority, the domain within which he was mandated to exercise his heroism, did not include the whole world. He had no authorization to exceed his mandate, and Enki, as the keeper of the me, was the appropriate enforcer of that boundary. The punishment was designed to be humiliating precisely because the offence was arrogance. A god who imagined his military triumph had freed him from constitutional limits was placed in a pit by a turtle. The symbolism was deliberate and precise. The victory that Ninurta had achieved in the mountains, the great destruction he had caused, had done nothing to change the fundamental structure of the divine order. He was still accountable to it. He could still be caught, immobilized, and lectured by the god who held the law. Ninurta's mother Ninmina appears at the end of the surviving text, grieving her son's predicament, and the text breaks off before we learn how or whether Ninurta was released. But the lesson of the episode is complete without its resolution. The divine code did not make exceptions for heroes. The enforcement of the code was not gratitude-based. Ninurta had done exactly what he was supposed to do in pursuing Anzu. That fact gave him no credit that could be spent on exceeding his mandate. The system recognised what he had done, it also recognised what he was planning to do, and the second recognition overrode the first. This symmetry, the recognition that even virtuous action in the service of the divine order does not exempt a god from its limits, is one of the most sophisticated elements of the Sumerian legal theological framework. It is the principle that there are no special cases, there are no divine heroes whose past services entitle them to act outside the code. Every entity, regardless of what they had done or who they were, operated within the same framework. The assembly assigned authority. The authority had limits. Exceeding those limits was an offence, regardless of the offender's track record. The 7 judges who could not be appealed, the Anunnaki of the Kur. In the Sumerian cosmological map, the world had 3 realms, the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the Kur below, the underworld, the realm of the dead. Each realm had its own governance, its own institutions, its own laws, and just as the upper world had the assembly of the Anunnaki governed by Enlil, the underworld had its own judicial body, the 7 Anunnaki who sat as judges in the dark country below the earth, presided over by Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. These 7 judges appear in the Descent of Inanna text with the same procedural precision that characterizes the upper world assembly. Their function is specific and bounded. They examine those who enter the underworld, they deliberate, and they pronounce the verdict that determines a soul's condition in the realm of the dead. They are called the Emin Anunna, the 7 Anunnaki. Their judgment, like the judgment of the upper assembly, is stated in the text to be unalterable. There is no appeal from their verdict. Their eyes are the eyes of death. When they fix their gaze on something, the result is determined. The descent of Inanna into the netherworld, ETCSL 1.4.1, preserved on CBS 13902 and N2986 at the Penn Museum, and on fragments from Nippur and a 74-line tablet discovered at tells the story of a goddess who decides to enter the underworld and discovers that its laws apply even to her. The text's reconstruction, completed in the 1950s, primarily through the work of Kramer and the combined effort of epigraphists working with tablets in Istanbul, Philadelphia, and New Haven, presents one of the most dramatically complete narratives in the Sumerian corpus. Inanna is the queen of heaven and earth. She is, in the hierarchy of the upper world, one of the most powerful deities in the pantheon. She has the me. She has her cult centers across Sumer. She is the goddess who determines the fate of kings, who governs the cycles of desire and war, whose divine authority is attested in some of the oldest inscriptions in the corpus. And when she enters the underworld, the 7 Anunnaki look at her and pronounce her guilty. The text is precise about the mechanism of her condemnation. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, as she descends, she is required to remove a piece of her divine regalia, her crown, her necklace, her breastplate, her garments, one by one, until she stands before Ereshkigal and the 7 judges stripped of every marker of her divine status. She is, in the underworld, not the Queen of Heaven. She is a deity who has entered a jurisdiction where her titles and powers carry no weight. The jurisdiction of the underworld is prior to and independent of her authority. Ereshkigal calls upon the Anunnaki judges. The text reads, "She cast a glance at Inanna, a deadly glance. She spoke against her a word, a furious word. She shouted against her a cry of damnation. The woman, thus mistreated, was turned into a corpse, and the corpse was hung on a peg." What had Inanna done to deserve this verdict? The text does not specify a particular offence in the juridical language it uses for Enlil's trial, but multiple interpretive traditions, including the analysis by historian Dina Katz, suggest that Inanna's presence in the underworld was itself a violation, an attempt to extend her power into a domain that belonged to another deity governed by another set of laws. The 7 judges of the underworld are not punishing Inanna for a moral failing. They are enforcing the constitutional boundary between their jurisdiction and hers. She entered their territory with the intention, the text implies, of taking it. She is therefore subject to their law, and their law says that those who come to the underworld stay there. What makes this passage particularly significant for our investigation is the source of the judge's authority. They are the Anunnaki, the same body, or a subset of the same body, that sits in the assembly above. But in the underworld, they are not enforcing the laws of the upper world. They are enforcing a separate but parallel code with its own principles, its own procedures, and its own binding verdicts. The divine legal framework is not a single unified code administered from one centre. It is a distributed system, with different jurisdictions operating under their own authority while remaining part of the same cosmic order. The rescue of Inanna, engineered by Enki through the creation of 2 genderless beings made from the dirt of his fingernails, who are able to enter the underworld without being subject to its laws, because they have no divine status to be forfeited, adds another dimension to this picture. The beings Enki creates do not argue with Ereshkigal. They do not invoke the authority of the upper assembly. They sympathize with her suffering. They offer comfort, and in response to their compassion, Ereshkigal offers them a reward. They ask for the corpse of Inanna. Ereshkigal provides it. Enki's creatures pour the food of life and the drink of life on the corpse. Inanna revives. But even then, the underworld law cannot simply be suspended. The 7 Anunnaki intervene. Whoever has descended to the underworld has never come out unscathed. If Inanna wants to return from the underworld, she must give us a substitute. The principle here is the same principle that governs the upper world legal code. Once a determination has been made, it cannot simply be reversed. The law of the underworld, that those who enter must remain, cannot be set aside, even for a goddess rescued by divine intervention. What can happen is that the law's requirements can be met by alternative means. A substitute must be found. The law's demand is satisfied, its structural integrity is preserved. The substitution of Dumuzi for Inanna is not a circumvention of the underworld's code. It is compliance with that code through an authorized mechanism. This is the system at its most sophisticated. The code is rigid in its principles and flexible in its application. It does not permit violations, but it does permit solutions that meet the code's requirements through means the original framing of the case had not anticipated. Enki, the keeper of the me, is the figure who most consistently finds these solutions, not because he can override the law, but because his comprehensive knowledge of the me allows him to identify the authorized mechanisms within the law that others have not noticed. Nergal's offense and the protocol of reparation. The story of Nergal and Ereshkigal survives in two distinct versions. An Amarna version, designated E357, discovered among the diplomatic archives of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten at Amarna in the 14th century Bek, and a longer version. From Sultan Tepe in Turkey, tablet number Su 1951-50, published by Wilfred G. Lambert and discussed extensively in subsequent scholarship. The two versions differ in significant details. The Amarna version is more archaic and compact, the Sultan Tepe version more elaborate and romantic, but they share a foundational narrative structure that illuminates a specific category of divine offence protocol violation. The offence is this: the gods are holding a great banquet in the heavens. Ereshkigal, as queen of the underworld, cannot attend. The law of the underworld requires her presence there. She cannot simply leave her realm to join the celestial feast. Instead, she sends her messenger Namtar to the heavens to collect her portion of the feast and bring it back. The gods receive Namtar, and in the established protocol of the divine world, all of them rise from their seats to honour him as Ereshkigal's representative. All of them, that is, except one. Nergal, the god who is eventually to become Ereshkigal's husband, does not rise. He remains seated. The offence is not physical. It is not violent. It is not a seizure of power or a contamination of sacred space or a theft of cosmic authority. It is a failure to observe protocol, a refusal to honour the representative of a goddess with the respect that the divine code required. And this is the extraordinary thing about how the Sumerian and Akkadian divine law texts treat the matter. This small, seemingly technical violation is treated as requiring formal reparation. Ereshkigal is informed of what happened. Her response is not immediate vengeance. She does not send plagues. She does not open the gates of the underworld and release the dead upon the living. She sends a message to Anu, the Skyfather and highest authority in the divine assembly. She demands that the god who failed to honour her representative be sent down to her to answer for the offence. The demand is complied with. This is significant. Anu does not protect Nergal from the consequences of his violation. He does not argue that Nergal's failure to stand was accidental or trivial. The protocol of the divine order was clear. A representative of a divine authority was entitled to formal honour. Nergal had not provided it. He must account for it to the offended party. In the Sultan Tepe version, Nergal descends to the underworld after Enki gives him specific instructions for how to navigate the encounter. He is told to do precisely the opposite of what instinct would suggest. He is to accept nothing from Ereshkigal. Not a seat, not a meal, not a drink, not water for his feet. He must refuse every hospitality, because accepting hospitality in the underworld creates an obligation that binds the recipient to that place. This detail reveals a sophisticated understanding of the legal dimensions of hospitality in the Sumerian world. A guest who receives hospitality accepts an obligation, and that obligation is enforceable. What happens when Nergal arrives before Ereshkigal is, depending on the version, either a 6-day stay of passionate intimacy or a more formal confrontation. But in both versions, the outcome is the same. Nergal does not simply apologise and return to the upper world. He and Ereshkigal reach an arrangement that transforms the nature of the underworld's governance. In the Sultan Tepe version, Nergal seizes Ereshkigal's throne and threatens to behead her, and she negotiates with him, offering him the kingship of the underworld in exchange for his restraint. The offer is accepted. Nergal becomes king of the underworld alongside Ereshkigal. The legal dimensions of this resolution are worth examining carefully. The protocol violation that initiated the episode, Nergal's failure to honour Namtar, was an offence committed in the upper world, governed by the laws of the Divine Assembly. The reparation demanded by Ereshkigal, his presence in the underworld to answer for the offence, was a claim made under the authority of the underworld's jurisdiction. The resolution, Nergal's assumption of the underworld kingship, is simultaneously a punishment, a reparation, and a constitutional change in the governance of the underworld. All of this was achieved not through warfare or divine decree from above, but through the formal application of the divine code, offence recognised, reparation demanded, presence compelled, and new arrangement established through negotiation between the relevant parties. Enki's role in this episode is, as always, that of the constitutional guide. He does not intervene to protect Nergal from the consequences of his offence. He provides Nergal with the knowledge, the me, of how to navigate the underworld's legal demands without losing himself entirely in the process. The divine code, in Enki's handling of every episode, is not an adversary to be escaped. It is a system to be understood, one whose demands, however severe, can be met by those who know it thoroughly enough to find the compliant path through its requirements. When the gods voted to destroy the Anunnaki and the flood decree, among all the decisions made by the Divine Assembly, the one that has attracted the most attention from scholars across the past century is the most drastic, the decree of the flood. The flood narrative appears in Sumerian form in the Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 10673 in the Penn Museum collection, a tablet that the Sumerologist Thorkild Jacobson and his colleagues worked to translate across several decades of the 20th century. It appears in Akkadian form in the Atrahasis epic, whose most complete version is British Museum tablet BM 78941+, and related tablets from the Old Babylonian period, with a later Assyrian version kept among the K-series tablets at Nineveh. The flood decree is, in the legal framework of the Sumerian Divine Code, a capital sentence, not issued against an individual, but against an entire population. The assembly of the Anunnaki deliberated and reached a verdict. Humanity had become too noisy, too troublesome, too disruptive of the order. The decree was issued. The flood was authorized. The existing human civilization was to be destroyed. The language of the Atrahasis epic in its deliberative passages is institutional. The gods convene. Enlil makes the case. The assembly agrees. The decision is formally made and given the binding force of the Nam. This is not Enlil acting on his own authority. It is the full assembly endorsing a collective decision to exercise the most extreme power available to it, the annihilation of what it had made. But then something extraordinary happens. Enki dissents. His dissent is not expressed through an open argument in the assembly. He does not, according to the text, stand before the gods and argue against the flood decree. The nature of his dissent is more complicated and more legally interesting. He has sworn an oath as a member of the assembly to uphold the decision. He will not break that oath. But he finds a mechanism within the divine code that allows him to preserve humanity without technically violating his oath. He goes to the wall of a reed hut where the hero of the flood, called Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, is sleeping, and he speaks to the wall. He tells the wall what the gods have decided. He tells the wall what must be done to survive. The hero, on the other side of the wall, hears everything. This is a legal maneuver of considerable sophistication. Enki has not warned the human being. He has warned a wall. The wall is not bound by any oath. The information has passed through a medium that is constitutionally separate from the divine assembly's deliberative body. Whatever the human being does with what he overhears is outside Enki's direct agency. Enki has complied with the letter of his oath. He has not betrayed the assembly's secret to a human being, while ensuring that the information reaches the party who needs it. The assembly later learns what Enki has done, and the confrontation between Enlil and Enki after the flood is one of the most charged passages in the entire Mesopotamian textual tradition. Enlil is furious. He had expected the flood to accomplish what the assembly decreed. The fact that one human family survived, floating on a great boat, preserving the seed of civilization, was a failure of the sentence's execution. Enki's response in the Atrahasis version is a legal argument. He points out that the flood was a disproportionate response, that more targeted punishments, plague, famine, drought, were available and would have served the assembly's purpose without destroying the very humanity that the gods had created to serve them. The punishment, Enki argues, was excessive relative to the offence. This is the introduction of proportionality into the divine legal framework. Enki is not arguing that the assembly had no authority to issue the decree. He is arguing that the assembly had chosen a measure whose scope exceeded what the offence required. This is a constitutional argument, and it is one that the assembly, at least in some versions of the narrative, ultimately accepts. The decision is made not to flood the world again. The limitations established at the end of the flood narrative, whatever form they take in different textual traditions, are understood as amendments to the divine code. The assembly's authority to destroy what it created is not entirely revoked, but it is constrained by a new principle: the punishment must fit the crime. Even the most extreme power available to the divine order cannot be exercised without regard to proportionality. Jacobson, in Treasures of Darkness, observed that this evolution in the divine framework, from a system in which the assembly could decree almost anything, to a system constrained by principles of proportionality and the preservation of what had been created, reflected a genuine development in Sumerian theological thinking. The flood narrative was not simply a cosmological story about water and survival. It was a record of a constitutional crisis and its resolution, the moment when the divine assembly's authority was not simply exercised, but contested, debated, and ultimately bounded by limits that had not previously been formally stated. Enki's role in this crisis is consistent with his role throughout the entire body of Sumerian divine law texts. He is not a rebel or an opponent of the divine order. He is its most sophisticated participant, the entity who knows the code well enough to use its own mechanisms against its potential abusers. He is, in the most precise sense available, the guardian of the code's integrity against the code's own worst impulses. The lament has legal record when cities were punished by divine decree. There is a genre of Sumerian literature that occupies an unusual position in the scholarly canon, not quite mythology, not quite history, not quite theology, but partaking of all three. These are the city laments, long, carefully composed poems that describe the destruction of great Sumerian cities, Nippur, Uruk, Eridu, and the withdrawal of the divine protection that had sustained them. The Lament for is preserved in a critical edition by Thorkild Jacobson and Samuel Noah Kramer, published by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago as Assyriological Studies, Volume 12, As 12. The Lament for Nippur is preserved on tablet CBS 3856 in the Penn Museum. These texts date to the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 BC, and are believed to have been composed to ritualize the traumatic historical destruction of these cities. In the case of the destruction by the Amorites and Elamites around 2004 BCE. What makes the city laments relevant to our investigation is their treatment of the destruction itself. In every surviving lament text, the city's destruction is not attributed to the superior military force of the invaders. It is attributed to a decision by the divine assembly, a formal withdrawal of divine protection, issued as a sentence against the city for reasons that are sometimes stated and sometimes implied. The Anunnaki are named explicitly as the deliberating body that authorized the destruction. The lament for opens with the goddess Ningal pleading before the divine assembly, before An and Enlil, arguing against the decree that has been issued for the city's destruction. Her argument is not that the city has done nothing wrong, it is that the punishment is too severe. She asks for the decree to be revised. She laments. She prostrates herself, and the assembly refuses to change its decision. The name has been decided. The fate of cannot be altered. This is a precise replication of the legal structure we have seen in other contexts. The goddess Ningal, patron of has standing before the assembly. She can make her case. She can argue for a different outcome. The assembly is obligated to hear her, but having heard her, it is not obligated to agree. The verdict stands, and the mechanism by which it stands is the same mechanism that stood behind Enlil's exile, the unalterable character of the assembly's formal determination. The physical agents of destruction, the enemy armies, the storms, the famines, are presented in the lament texts not as independent historical forces, but as instruments of the divine sentence. They are authorized instruments. The Anunnaki did not stop them, because the Anunnaki had decreed their coming. The abandonment of the city's protective deities, the patron goddess leaving her city, the specific protective spirits withdrawing, is presented in the same legal language as other verdicts. The god no longer holds the me for this city. The me for its protection have been reassigned. The city is exposed. This framing reveals something important about how the Sumerians understood the relationship between divine law and historical events. History, in the Sumerian framework, was not random. It was the working out of divine decisions. Cities rose because their divine patrons were authorized to hold the me of kingship and civilization. Cities fell because those authorizations were withdrawn. The withdrawal was not capricious. It was the result of a deliberative process, a formal determination reached by a constituted body. The destruction of was not Enlil's anger, it was the assembly's verdict. The scholar Al-Henegadotti, examining the lamentation genre, notes that the city laments function simultaneously as theological documents, as ritual texts used in temple ceremonies of mourning and restoration, and as historical records of the assembly's judicial actions. The ritualized repetition of the lament text in temple practice was not simply a mourning exercise. It was, in the framework of Sumerian religious thought, a proper response to a divine verdict, an acknowledgement that the verdict had been issued, an expression of grief at its consequences, and an implicit petition for the reassignment of the me to the city's restored institutions. The Anunnaki in the lament texts are not absent gods who have turned their faces away in disinterest. They are present and deliberating authorities who have made a specific decision and expect it to be acknowledged. The lament is the human and divine community's formal response to that verdict. It is the acknowledgement without which the restoration cannot begin, because restoration in this system requires the proper recognition of what has happened and why. 3 ways to read the same verdict. Synthesis of the evidence. We have now examined, across 7 separate textual cases, the trial of Enlil, the transfer of the me, the theft of the Tablet of Destinies, the punishment of Ninurta's arrogance, the judgment of Inanna in the underworld, the protocol offence of Nergal, and the flood decree, a remarkably consistent body of material. The consistency extends beyond shared themes. It extends to specific institutional structures, specific legal formulas, specific procedural features, and specific principles of divine accountability that appear, independently attested, across texts composed by different scribal schools in different cities over a span of roughly 1,500 years. CBS 9205 in Philadelphia uses the same phrase as the lamentation texts from Nippur. The Anzu myth from Nineveh uses the same constitutional framework as the me transfer narrative from Eridu. The underworld judgment in the descent of Inanna replicates the same 7-judge structure as the upper world assembly. This is the moment in any investigation where interpretation becomes unavoidable. The texts have been examined. The evidence is on the table. The question is what to do with it. There are 3 coherent frameworks within which this body of material can be understood, and each of them has serious scholarly advocates and serious intellectual merit. They are not mutually exclusive. A single text can be read through all 3 lenses simultaneously, and in some cases the most accurate reading is precisely that superposition. The first framework is the purely mythological reading. In this interpretation, the divine trials, verdicts and punishments in the Sumerian texts are theological narratives, stories composed to make sense of the world, to explain natural phenomena, to encode social values in divine drama, and to provide communities with meaningful accounts of their historical experiences. Enlil's Exile encodes the social norm against sexual coercion. Inanna's Judgment encodes the inevitability of death even for the most powerful. The Flood Decree encodes the community's experience of catastrophic destruction and its attempt to find meaning in that experience. On this reading, the legal language in the text is borrowed from human institutions to give divine drama texture and familiarity. It makes the stories feel real, feel consequential, feel governed by recognizable principles. This reading is not wrong. The texts undeniably function in these ways, and scholars including Jacobson and Black have documented these functions with considerable precision. The question is whether this reading exhausts what the texts are doing. The second framework is the wisdom literature reading, the interpretation that treats the divine law texts as sophisticated philosophical documents using the frame of divine governance to explore questions of political theory, constitutional structure, and the nature of authority. In this reading, the Sumerians were not simply telling stories about their gods. They were thinking, through those stories, about the relationship between power and legitimacy, about the necessity of accountability even for the most powerful, about the difference between authority derived from a source outside oneself and authority derived from mere physical dominance. The divine assembly is a model of legitimate governance, one in which even the supreme deity must answer to a constituted body, is, on this reading, a political philosophy expressed through theological narrative. This reading has its own serious advocates. The legal historian Martha Roth, whose compilation of Mesopotamian law collections published by the Society of Biblical Literature in 1997 documents the deep connection between divine authorization and human legal codes, has noted that the invocation of divine mandate in human law texts is not decorative. The kings who issued law codes, Ulnamu, Lipitishtar, Hammurabi, grounded those codes explicitly in divine commissioning. The Me of judgment and decision-making were among Inanna's most carefully enumerated divine attributes. The human law code was, in this framework, a manifestation of a divine me, and its authority depended on the divine order from which it derived. On this reading, the Sumerians were not inventing a political philosophy, they were documenting the divine template for one. The third framework is the historical documentation reading, the interpretation that treats the Sumerian divine law text not as mythology or wisdom literature primarily, but as preserved memory of an actual historical reality framed within the theological language available to those who preserved it. This is the most contested framework among mainstream scholars, but it is not one that can be simply dismissed. Jacobson himself, in his later work, suggested that the memory preserved in the most archaic Sumerian literary traditions may reach back to organisational structures and practices of an early period for which we have no direct historical documentation. The oral traditions from which the written texts emerged may preserve, embedded within their mythological framing, genuine institutional memories of governance structures that preceded the earliest written records. The evidence for this third reading is indirect but not trivial. The consistency of the divine legal framework across independent texts spanning 15 centuries is easier to explain if the framework reflects something real, either something real about actual divine governance in whatever sense one wishes to interpret that claim, or something real about very early human governance that was later attributed to divine authority. The specific procedural details, the formulaic phrases, the institutional vocabulary, the named roles, the consistent structural features, are precisely the kind of details that get preserved when institutional memory is strong, and precisely the kind of details that drift and blur when tradition is purely literary or decorative. The strongest counter-argument to all three readings is the same: we simply do not know enough. The Sumerian textual corpus, vast as it is by the standards of the ancient world, remains fragmentary. New tablets are still being discovered and translated. The interpretive frameworks available to modern scholars are inevitably shaped by modern assumptions about what religion is, what mythology is, what law is, and what it means for a tradition to remember something. The Sumerians may have understood all of this in ways we have not yet fully recovered. What we can say with the confidence the evidence supports is this: the divine law framework in the Sumerian texts is too consistent, too procedurally specific, and too deeply embedded across too many independent textual traditions to be explained as simple literary decoration. Whatever it was, myth, philosophy, or institutional memory, it was something the Sumerians took seriously, returned to repeatedly, and inscribed with the precision of people who wanted to get the record right, what the code implies, if the laws were real. An investigation like this one always reaches a point where the evidence invites a question that the evidence alone cannot answer. We have followed the divine law from its philosophical foundations in the me, through the documented institutional procedures of the Ukin, through 7 specific cases of divine violation and their legal resolutions, through the ultimate test of the flood decree and its constitutional aftermath, and into the ritualized acknowledgement of divine verdicts preserved in the city laments. The pattern is clear. The framework is real, in the sense that it was real to those who inscribed it. The question that remains is the one the title of this investigation points toward: what does it mean that the gods who made the laws also had to follow them? If we take the wisdom literature reading seriously, the implication is profound for political philosophy. The Sumerians, in framing their cosmos as a place governed by law that pre-existed the most powerful entities within it, were articulating a principle that most human political traditions have struggled to establish: that authority is not self-grounding, that the legitimacy of a decree does not come from the power of the one who issues it, but from the relationship between that decree and a framework of law that the decree must answer to. Enlil's utterances could not be altered, but Enlil himself could be arrested by the assembly that authorized his utterances. Power and authority were not the same thing. They never had been. This has consequences for how we understand the earliest recorded history of law itself. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the world's oldest surviving law code, dated to approximately 2100-2050 BC, and preserved on tablets now in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum and the Penn Museum, grounds its authority explicitly in divine mandate. Ur-Nammu, the text says, was chosen by the moon god Nanna and empowered by the cosmic authority of Enlil to establish justice in the land. The human law code is not a human invention. It is a transmission of the divine me for judgment and decision making into the human realm. The king does not create law. The king administers a me that pre-existed him, that was assigned to him by the divine order, and for which he is accountable to that order. If the divine law framework in the Sumerian texts is not simply myth but encoded institutional wisdom, then what the Sumerians were saying, with considerable consistency and precision, is this: justice is not what the powerful decide. Justice is what the order requires. And the order requires it of everyone, of the gods who hold its me, of the kings who carry its mandate, of the heroes who enforce its provisions, and even of the assemblies that deliberate in its name. No entity at any level of the cosmic hierarchy is exempt from accounting for how it has managed the authority it was given. The further implication, the one that sits at the most speculative edge of what the evidence supports, concerns the origin of the code itself. In the texts, the me are not created by any of the gods we encounter. Enki holds them, but he did not make them. The Tablet of Destinies confers authority on Enlil, but it is not described as Enlil's creation. The divine assembly makes decisions under the authority of the Nam, but the name is older than the assembly. Somewhere upstream of all the divine entities whose actions the texts record, there is a source from which the divine code derives, an Enki, a heaven and earth foundation that preceded the gods who administered it. The Sumerians called this the principle of me in its most primordial sense. It was not a god. It was not a thing that could be described. It was the condition of there being order at all, the fact that existence was arranged rather than merely existent. And it was, in the Sumerian framework, as old as anything could be, older than the flood, older than the gods, older than the assembly that governed them. If civilization is the restoration of something, rather than its invention, if what the Sumerians were recording was not the first emergence of law, but its recovery, its reconstruction, its careful reinscription in clay after some older expression of it had been lost, then the divine law texts are not mythology in the usual sense. They are memory. The memory of a time when the laws that governed everything were known, held, administered and respected. When the assembly met and the 50 great gods and the 7 who decided destinies could still convene with the full weight of the original code behind them. Whether that time was literal, symbolic or philosophical, whether it points to something that actually happened, or to an ideal that the Sumerians aspired toward, or to a fundamental truth about the nature of order, is not a question the tablets can answer. They can only raise it, with their peculiar combination of precision and silence, pressing it into the clay for those who come after to read and consider. And it is, at minimum, a question worth having thought about. What remains in the clay? Somewhere in a storage room in Philadelphia, tablet CBS 9205 continues to exist. It is not displayed. Most visitors to the Penn Museum walk through its galleries without knowing the tablet is there, in a climate-controlled storage facility occupying a few cubic inches of space in a drawer among thousands of others. It is smaller than a hardcover book. Its surface is pale and worn. The cuneiform impressions made into it, pressed by a human hand using a reed stylus approximately 4,000 years ago, are still legible. The person who pressed those impressions did not know that we would still be reading them. They were copying an older text, working in a scribal school in the temple complex of Nippur, learning their craft by reproducing the literature of their civilization. The text they were copying was already old when they copied it. The events it described, the arrest of Enlil, the verdict of the 50 great gods, the sentence delivered in accordance with what had been decided, were from their perspective part of the foundational order of things, not ancient mythology, the background condition of the world. What is remarkable when you sit with the full weight of what we've examined tonight is not the strangeness of it, it is the familiarity. The questions embedded in these texts are the same questions that human beings have been asking since the moment we first understood that we lived in a world governed by rules, questions about where those rules came from, about what happens when the most powerful violate them, about whether there is something prior to every authority that makes that authority legitimate or illegitimate, about whether justice is a convention or something built into the structure of existence itself. The Sumerians were asking those questions 4,000 years ago in the world's first cities, in the world's first written literature, pressing their inquiries into tablets of wet clay that they then set in the sun to harden. They did not answer the questions. They documented them with extraordinary care and returned to them generation after generation, as if the act of preserving the record was itself a form of reverence, a recognition that some questions are too important to let slip, even if the answers remain out of reach. We have followed the divine code tonight through its most important documented cases. We have seen it applied to the greatest God in the cosmos. We have seen it resist the seizure of its own foundational document. We have seen it enforce boundaries on heroes who exceeded their mandates, condemn goddesses who entered the wrong jurisdiction, compel protocol offenders to answer for their discourtesy, authorize and then constrain the most extreme punishment in the divine record. And we have seen it preserved, after the destruction of the cities that first inscribed it, in the careful lamentation of those who mourned not just the cities, but the divine order those cities had embodied. The phrase that stays with me, the one that keeps returning in all its formal, measured certainty, is the phrase that appears at the moment of Enlil's arrest. Not the arrest itself, not the verdict, the aftermath, the moment when the greatest administrative authority in the Sumerian cosmos rises from whatever he was doing in the Kiur, looks at the assembled gods who have just condemned him, and begins to walk toward the city gate, in accordance with what had been decided. He goes because it was decided, not because he had no power, not because he agreed with the verdict, but because the code that gave him his authority was the same code that had just been turned against him, and he understood, however he felt about it, however the texts record his feelings in the episodes that follow, that the code did not answer to him. He answered to it, as they all did, as perhaps in the most fundamental and quietly radical claim embedded in the world's oldest literature, everything does. The questions remain open. They have always remained open. That is the honest resting place for a record like this one, not a conclusion, but a place where thought can settle for a night, where the accumulated weight of 4,000 years of careful inscription can lie quietly beside you, and where whatever you make of it is, in the end, yours to decide. These were the laws. This was the code. And even the gods who made them had to answer for what they did with them. If tonight's investigation reached you, if the quiet precision of a 4,000-year-old legal record said something unexpected to you, the best way to carry that forward is simply to leave a word below. Where you listened from, what you heard. The tablets have always been waiting for someone to read them. Sleep well.